A war between the United States and China is no longer a distant possibility. It's becoming a question of when, not if. Both sides are rapidly militarizing, circling each other like giants in the dark. Taiwan is the spark, semiconductors are the fuel, and global stability is the cost. The world may hope for peace, but behind closed doors, every move points to war. From shifting demographics and collapsing economies to stealth fighters, cyber attacks, and nuclear brinkmanship, this isn't just a rivalry, it's a countdown. So why is a US-China war becoming inevitable? And what terrifying lessons has China already learned from the war in Ukraine? Let's dive in. Ever since Taiwan split from China in the aftermath of World War II, China has used the fact that the island was Chinese territory to claim sovereignty over it. However, during the Cold War, the US initially recognized the government in Taipei as the sole inheritor of the Chinese territory, which further complicated matters. Combined with China being a communist country dependent on the Soviet Union for growth and modernization, it couldn't exert geopolitical or militaristic influence to invade. So for decades, Beijing maintained that time was on Taipei's side regarding Taiwan. The original assumption was that growing economic integration would gradually pull the island into China's orbit, making eventual reunification inevitable. This belief also underpinned China's relative restraint and willingness to accept the ambiguous status quo. If Taiwan would come back into the fold willingly, China calculated that it would be too risky to provoke the much larger NATO by trying to plunge the Indo-Pacific into a war. But in recent years, that calculation has fundamentally changed. Taiwan's population has undergone a profound identity shift that makes peaceful integration increasingly implausible. In 1995, approximately 80% of Taiwan's citizens identified as either exclusively Chinese or both Chinese and Taiwanese. By 2023, that figure had collapsed to just 28%, with those identifying as exclusively Taiwanese rising to 67%. The change in the population's national identity correlated with a near 180 turn in its political aspirations. Support for eventual independence has climbed steadily, with a 2025 poll showing 51.8% of Taiwanese adults favor independence, compared to 24.2% who prefer maintaining the status quo and 13.3% who support unification with China. Compare this with the view in 1991, when only 1/8 of the surveyed population supported complete independence from Communist China. Beijing views this shift with growing alarm. It has led Chinese officials to increasingly believe that the dream of peaceful reunification is slipping away, replaced by the prospect of a permanently separated Taiwan that would inevitably press for independence. President Xi Jinping has explicitly linked reunification with Taiwan to his vision of the Great Rejuvenation of the Chinese nation by 2049. The year 2049 marks a century after the establishment of the People's Republic of China and the Taiwanese split. Simultaneously, Taiwan has become more integrated into the American-led security regime in Asia. US arms sales have increased in both quantity and quality. Military training and coordination have deepened. Japan and South Korea have also voiced concerns over China's increasing influence and offensive posturing in the Indo-Pacific, practically aligning their national defense policies with Taiwan's territorial sovereignty. This growing web of relationships makes Taiwan's absorption into China more geopolitically consequential with each passing year. But what truly made China's calculations go awry was the economic reversal in the region. Rather than becoming more economically dependent on China, Taiwan has diversified its trade relationships and reduced its mainland exposure. The Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, aka the TSMC, has emerged as the world's most important chip manufacturer, producing over 60% of the world's semiconductors and over 90% of the most advanced ones. At the same time, the industry generates roughly a quarter of Taiwan's GDP. This creates a notable boost to the local economy that is completely independent and even competitive with China, as the latter is one of the few large semiconductor producers in the world. But while the prospects for peaceful unification diminish, China's ability to take Taiwan by force has dramatically increased. The People's Liberation Army, or PLA, has transformed from a technologically backward force into a modern military, capable of conducting complex joint operations across air, sea, land, space, and cyberspace. The scale of China's military modernization is staggering. Between 2013 and 2023, China commissioned more naval ships than the entire current fleet of most major European powers. The PLA Navy now commands the world's largest fleet by number of vessels. In the air, China has developed and deployed fifth-generation stealth fighters like the J-20, dramatically upgraded its bomber fleet with the H-6N, capable of carrying hypersonic missiles, and invested heavily in unmanned aerial vehicles. Its air defense systems, particularly the S-400 purchased from Russia, and indigenously developed HQ-9 systems, create formidable anti-access bubbles that could complicate US air operations. Most concerning for Taiwan's defense, China has amassed the world's largest arsenal of conventional, ballistic, and cruise missiles. The PLA rocket force fields approximately 2,200 ground-launched ballistic and cruise missiles, most of which could target Taiwan. This includes hundreds of DF-21 medium-range ballistic missiles and DF-26 intermediate-range ballistic missiles capable of striking US bases throughout the region, such as Guam. In a hypothetical war, these missiles would target the island's military bases, command centers, and communications infrastructure in the opening hours of conflict. Simultaneously, they would threaten US and allied bases across the region, potentially delaying American intervention. Meanwhile, China's naval forces could establish a blockade that would strangle Taiwan's economy while its amphibious units prepared for a potential invasion. This military transformation didn't happen by accident. It stems from decades of focused investment, technology acquisition, both legitimate and through espionage, and strategic planning specifically oriented toward reunification scenarios. Chinese military exercises around Taiwan have grown increasingly sophisticated, transitioning from shows of force to realistic rehearsals for blockade and invasion operations. More impressively, and unfortunately for the US and Taiwan, China has managed this transformation while maintaining an economy roughly 25% smaller than America's, in nominal terms, and that is only according to more recent years. Remember, China started as a communist party that practically belonged to developing nations just mere decades ago. If you look at the economic growth chart, you'll see growth in around double-digit percentages, far above the world average. It has led to the country's economy doubling every 8 to 10 years for a total growth of around 1,412% since 1989. But that growth tells only part of the story. Nominally, the country is poised to overtake the US by economy size, as its purchasing power parity is already ahead of the US by around 27%. However, that growth came hand in hand with modernization, which made China face structural challenges in its society and industry, which ultimately can reflect on the country's geopolitical aspirations. The most immediate crisis is in real estate, which accounts for roughly a third of China's GDP. Property developers have accumulated over $500 billion in debt, with companies like Evergrande and Country Garden defaulting on obligations. House prices in major cities have declined for consecutive quarters, eroding the primary store of wealth for many Chinese families. According to Goldman Sachs, the total value of unsold homes, unfinished projects, and unused land in China is about $4.1 trillion. Youth unemployment has reached alarming levels. Before the government stopped publishing the figure in mid-2023, youth unemployment had reached 21.3%, up from 15% just 2 years before, and independent estimates suggest the true figure may exceed 30% in urban areas. This creates not just economic hardship, but potential political instability as educated young people struggle to find opportunities commensurate with their expectations. Demographic changes further complicate China's outlook. The working-age population peaked in 2014 and is projected to shrink more rapidly as a result of long-standing fertility-reducing policies. Namely, this was caused by the infamous one-child policy instituted in 1981, which was relaxed only in 2014 by allowing couples to have 2 children if both of them were only children. However, this is still below the recommended replacement rate of 2.1 births per woman. As a result, China faces the prospect of growing old before growing rich. Furthermore, in 2022, China's population actually declined for the first time since the Great Leap Forward in 1958, marking the beginning of what demographers expect to be a century-long population contraction. It's resulted in India overtaking China as the world's most populous nation. Productivity growth, which drove China's economic miracle, has also slowed dramatically. Total factor productivity grew at just 0.7% annually over the past decade, down from 2.8% in the early 2000s. This decline reflects diminishing returns on investment, inefficient capital allocation, and a shift away from the market reforms that propelled earlier growth. The stalling of total factor productivity, or TFP growth, directly correlates with the country's GDP slowing its growth, in what was once double digits stabilizing to around 5% growth per year. While the growth rate is still above that of the Western world, China's economy has become much more dependent on external factors, which means that it could drop to follow the lead of the US, essentially never catching up. This leads to an interesting phenomenon, where China's global economic position has also weakened. The Belt and Road Initiative, once Beijing's flagship foreign economic policy that was supposed to cost $8 trillion, has delivered mixed results at best. Numerous projects have faced allegations of corruption, environmental damage, and unsustainable debt burdens for host countries. Malaysia, Myanmar, and several African nations have cancelled or renegotiated Chinese infrastructure projects after concluding the terms were unfavorable. These economic challenges create a dangerous dynamic for cross-strait relations. Historically, authoritarian regimes facing domestic economic difficulties often turn to nationalism and external adventures to distract their populations and rally support. For Chinese President Xi Jinping, who has staked his legitimacy on delivering the China dream of national rejuvenation, Taiwan presents a ready target that would solve some of China's most pressing issues. Most consequentially, China has found itself increasingly cut off from the advanced semiconductor technology that powers modern economies. The United States has implemented comprehensive export controls on cutting-edge chips and the equipment needed to produce them. These restrictions have been joined by similar measures from Japan and the Netherlands, creating a coordinated effort to prevent China from achieving semiconductor self-sufficiency. And the Taiwanese TSMC has stopped selling its most advanced chips to Chinese companies, creating a technological gap that widens as chip technology advances. This circles back to the importance of chips in the modern world. TSMC produces approximately 90% of the world's most advanced chips, those with nodes smaller than 10 nanometers. These semiconductors power everything from smartphones and data centers to advanced weapons systems and artificial intelligence applications. Without access to these chips, modern economies and militaries simply cannot function at full capacity. This creates an extraordinary strategic vulnerability for both China and the United States. For Beijing, lack of access to cutting-edge semiconductors threatens to permanently constrain its technological development and military modernization. For Washington, Taiwan's potential fall to China would give Beijing control over a critical choke point in global technology supply chains. This technological dimension adds a novel element to cross-strait tensions. Throughout history, resources like coal, oil, and strategic minerals have motivated territorial conquest. In the 21st century, semiconductor manufacturing capability represents a new kind of strategic resource, one that happens to be concentrated on an island China already claims for historical and national reasons. And then there's another important factor why Taiwan is so important to China: geography. The island forms part of what strategists call the first island chain that constrains Chinese naval access to the open ocean. Control of Taiwan would give the PLA Navy ready access to the Philippine Sea and significantly complicate American defense of allies like Japan and the Philippines. China's alignment with Russia adds another volatile element to cross-strait dynamics. The parallels between Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's ambitions regarding Taiwan are striking and deeply concerning for regional stability. Like Russian President Vladimir Putin with Ukraine, Xi frames Taiwan as a historically Chinese territory wrongfully separated from the motherland. Both leaders consider reunification a core national objective necessary to reverse historical humiliations. Both Russia and China have engaged in massive military buildups specifically designed to achieve these territorial ambitions while avoiding or deterring Western involvement, with mixed success. The Ukraine war is basically a potent prophecy of Taiwan's future, with both good and bad news. On one hand, Russia's struggle to defeat a determined defender suggests Taiwan could resist a Chinese invasion if properly armed and motivated. Ukraine's success in sinking Russian naval vessels demonstrates how anti-ship missiles and drones can neutralize larger naval forces, a strategy Taiwan has embraced with its porcupine defense strategy. On the other hand, Western hesitation to directly confront nuclear-armed Russia might embolden China to believe the United States would similarly limit its involvement in a Taiwan conflict. The slow initial Western response to Ukraine and subsequent disputes over arms supplies, which persisted for years, could suggest to Beijing that a swift, decisive operation might face less resistance than a protracted conflict. Most troublingly, China might draw a specific lesson from Ukraine: that Russia's principal mistake was not moving fast enough and with sufficient force. China's continued support for Russia's war effort, despite Western pressure, reveals Beijing's willingness to challenge the international status quo. Through diplomatic backing, increased trade, and technological support, China has helped Russia practically skirt Western sanctions. This assistance comes despite the significant reputational damage China has incurred in Europe and other regions. This Russia-China alignment creates dangerous feedback loops. Western powers, already strained by supporting Ukraine, may have limited resources to deter Chinese aggression. Simultaneously, the more China helps Russia evade sanctions, the more Beijing learns about how to insulate itself from similar measures if it moves against Taiwan. But while a Russia-Ukraine conflict directly threatens the European part of NATO, where the US is generally a minor actor, at least on paper, a China-Taiwan war would directly force the US center stage. That's if the US doesn't decide to completely back out. Under former President Joe Biden, the United States significantly strengthened its commitment to Taiwan's defense. Biden stated on at least 4 occasions that the US would directly defend Taiwan from Chinese attack. These were departures from the long-standing policy of strategic ambiguity that were subsequently walked back by White House officials. Nevertheless, these statements, combined with increased arms sales and training programs, signaled a more robust American commitment to Taiwan's security. The second administration of President Donald Trump, however, has introduced greater unpredictability. During his 2024 campaign, Trump questioned whether the United States should defend Taiwan, suggesting the island should pay for its protection. After his inauguration, the administration has offered contradictory signals, with some officials reaffirming traditional security commitments while others have emphasized the need for burden sharing and diplomatic flexibility. This uncertainty is compounded by America's domestic challenges. Political polarization, infrastructure deficiencies, and periodic government funding crises raise questions about Washington's ability to sustain long-term strategic competition with China. The United States also faces resource constraints given commitments in Europe, the Middle East, and other regions. The intensifying technology competition further complicates matters. The Biden administration implemented unprecedented restrictions on semiconductor technology transfers to China, a policy the Trump administration has maintained while exploring potential modifications. China has responded by accelerating its own semiconductor development efforts and restricting exports of critical materials like rare earth elements, which are essential for everything from electric vehicles to precision-guided munitions. From Beijing's perspective, this confusing mix of signals might create both danger and opportunity. If the US is busy solving domestic, economic, and political issues, it creates an opening for China to swoop in and occupy Taiwan before the US and its allies can intervene. At the same time, Trump's unpredictable rhetoric could also lead to a severe escalation of conflict, far above what China can weather at the moment. The key question becomes whether Chinese leaders believe the window of opportunity for action is opening or closing. And with the current US administration seemingly making one contradictory move after the next, that window might be more of a revolving door. But what if China does invade Taiwan and incite war with the US? If the war is truly inevitable, when should we expect it? The most commonly cited timeframe is 2027. US military leaders, including former Indo-Pacific Commander Admiral Philip Davidson, have identified this date as a potential deadline for Chinese action. By 2027, China's military modernization programs are expected to reach sufficient maturity to give Beijing a credible invasion capability. Xi, who will likely still be in power, could view this symbolic year as an opportunity to cement his legacy by resolving the Taiwan issue. The invasion would then be staged right before his third term ends in 2028. Creating additional opportunity to become a leader for life, despite China's policies previously only allowing 2 terms. Alternatively, Beijing might decide to move even earlier. The longer China waits, the more robust Taiwan's defenses become, considering that it's seemingly accepted paying for defensive equipment from the US. Additionally, the war in Ukraine is poised to continue practically indefinitely, considering that Europe has stepped up to provide more support for Ukraine, and Russia devolved into a wartime economy. If NATO pledges to give more of its production capacity directly to Ukraine, the US might decide to reverse course and step away from the conflict entirely. This could embolden China to act while the US is busy redefining its international relations. But regardless of when the war starts and the scale, i.e. the parties involved, it would likely have a relatively straightforward structure. China will most likely begin with cyber attacks, followed by creating a maritime blockade around Taiwan. The increased pressure on Taiwan's ports would cripple the island's export-based economy, trying to force its capitulation without necessitating the enormous risks of a combined naval ground invasion. However, any action against Taiwan that would be construed as militaristic in nature would likely trigger some form of American response. This could include the blockade. As such, China would likely go all in from the start, using long-range missiles to remove Taiwanese and American military bases and defense infrastructure surrounding the island. It would practically ensure the US responds via military confrontation, and if US military bases do end up being attacked, the US could invoke Article 5 of the NATO alliance for the second time in history, bringing the other 31 members into the conflict. So with this sword of Damocles hanging over the world's head, what can be done to at least delay the inevitable? For the United States, the challenge involves balancing deterrence with reassurance. This would require substantial investments in the capabilities most relevant to Taiwan's defense: anti-ship missiles, air defense systems, submarines, unmanned systems, and distributed basing infrastructure throughout the region. Simultaneously, Washington would need to maintain communication channels with Beijing and avoid symbolic provocations that counter Chinese nationalist tendencies. For Taiwan, the imperative is to become a porcupine, too painful to swallow. This means investing in asymmetric capabilities rather than prestige platforms, dispersing critical infrastructure, stockpiling essential supplies, and preparing the population for resistance. For China, avoiding war would require accepting that Taiwan's reintegration might not happen in the current regime's life cycle, which would be a complete departure from what was essentially 80 years of waiting and buildup. It would also mean China would need to actively seek reforms that alleviate its growing economic and demographic crisis that don't rely on international conflicts and geopolitics. These issues are similar to what many other countries have failed to do and are likely incompatible with China's posturing as a world power. Unfortunately, these requirements for prolonging peace run directly opposite the efforts of the nations involved. In Washington, restraint is often equated with weakness, especially given Trump's penchant for conducting transactional diplomacy, equating it to two-sided economics rather than multifaceted geopolitics. In Taipei, the younger generation increasingly pushes for independence, even if not outwardly presenting this opinion. In Beijing, the nationalist rhetoric has put autocratic leadership into a corner where compromise could be perceived as betrayal. If none of these factors change meaningfully, then China would be practically forced to attack Taiwan, as not doing so would effectively plunge it back into the obscurity it came from before the Soviet Union fell. But what do you think? Is the US-China war going to happen in the 2020s, or will it be delayed? Thanks for watching as always, and leave your comments below.